Nestled in a quiet neighborhood in Los Angeles, Karl Malden's former home exudes a classic charm that reflects the actor's iconic career. However, for years, the house has been the subject of eerie whispers and unsettling accounts from those who dare to step inside. The first account came from a family who moved into the house in the late 1990s. One evening, as they were unpacking boxes in the living room, they heard a deep, resonant voice coming from the study. It sounded as though someone was reciting lines from a play. The father, a history teacher, thought a neighbor might have wandered in and went to check. The study, however, was empty. The voice ceased as soon as he stepped inside, leaving behind only an oppressive stillness. The family began to notice other strange phenomena. Late at night, they would hear muffled applause and laughter, as if an unseen audience was seated in the house. On several occasions, the sound of an old radio playing faint swing music filled the living room. Yet, the house had no radios and no electronic devices were running. A repair technician brought in to inspect the wiring found nothing unusual. "It's like the walls themselves are singing," he remarked uneasily. One night, the eldest daughter invited a friend over. As they studied in the dining room, the deep voice returned, this time louder and more distinct. The words sounded like Shakespearean prose, though neither girl could make out the exact phrases. When they followed the sound, they found it emanating from a wall. Her friend swore she saw the faint outline of a man's shadow cross the room, though no one else was present. The family eventually moved out, citing unexplainable disturbances as one reason. Subsequent owners reported similar events. A young couple who briefly rented the home described a recurring dream of sitting in a theater, only to wake and find themselves hearing the same applause in the distance. One morning, the wife found a playbill from the 1940s lying on the kitchen counter. She swore it hadn't been there the night before. Some local historians believe the house may be replaying echoes of Karl Malden's illustrious career. A fervent lover of theater, Malden spent hours rehearsing lines and discussing roles within those walls. His passion for performance might have imprinted itself on the house, like a residual energy that refuses to fade. While the house remains a beautiful relic of Hollywood's golden age, its unsettling reputation ensures that only the brave or the skeptical consider it a permanent home. To this day, passers-by claim they hear muffled voices through the windows at dusk, and an inexplicable warmth seems to radiate from the house when the city falls silent. Whether the phenomenon is Malden's spirit or merely a trick of acoustics, one thing is certain: the house continues to tell a story, long after its most famous resident has departed. In 2015, the house was rented by a group of aspiring actors, drawn to its Hollywood legacy. They viewed it as an inspiring sanctuary, a place to rehearse lines and immerse themselves in their craft. But inspiration soon gave way to something darker. On their first night, the group gathered in the living room to celebrate their move. As the night wore on, they began to hear faint, overlapping voices coming from the direction of the study. At first, they dismissed it as a neighbor's television. But when they went to investigate, the voices grew louder, distinct, authoritative, and oddly theatrical. One of them joked that they had a ghostly acting coach. The real unease began a week later. Julia, one of the tenants, woke in the middle of the night to the sound of a man's voice reciting lines from a play she recognized, Death of a Salesman. The words were spoken with such emotion that she felt compelled to follow the sound. It led her to the study, where the air was icy, and the voice abruptly stopped. The next morning, she shared the experience with her housemates. To her surprise, she wasn't alone. Greg, another tenant, claimed he had heard the same voice while working in the living room the night before. But Greg's encounter was stranger. He swore he saw a faint glow, like stage lighting, coming from the corner of the room. As the days passed, the housemates grew accustomed to the nightly disturbances. Voices rehearsing monologues, footsteps pacing the upstairs hall, and the faint hum of an old radio became part of their routine. Yet, none of them felt truly threatened until the weekend of the storm. A violent thunderstorm rolled over Los Angeles, plunging the neighborhood into darkness. The tenants lit candles and gathered in the living room to wait it out. As the rain lashed against the windows, the old radio music returned, louder than ever. This time, it was accompanied by the crackling sound of static. Then came the voice. It was deep, authoritative, and chillingly clear. "Places, everyone," it said, as though calling actors to a stage. The living room temperature plummeted, and the candles flickered violently. Greg, trying to be brave, responded with a nervous laugh. "Okay, who's playing director now?" No one laughed with him. Instead, they all froze as a shadow moved across the far wall, cast by no visible source of light. The shadow seemed to pause, then turned as if addressing an invisible audience. "Act 2, the voice announced, echoing through the room. A sudden, overwhelming pressure filled the space, as though they were no longer alone. Julia screamed as the antique mirror above the fireplace cracked down the middle, revealing a sliver of darkness that seemed deeper than the room behind it. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The crack in the mirror wasn't just a fracture. It almost seemed alive, widening imperceptibly as the housemates stared in horrified silence. The voice came again, clearer this time, and laced with a strange urgency. "Focus. This is your moment." The words were followed by a low, rhythmic hum, like the tuning of an orchestra, coming from somewhere deep within the house. The sound didn't echo as it should have. Instead, it seemed to absorb into the walls, growing heavier with each passing second. Greg, shaking but determined to appear unafraid, stepped toward the mirror. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. The shadow on the wall shifted, almost as if it was watching him. It didn't respond, but the hum intensified, vibrating the floor beneath their feet. Suddenly, the radio music cut out, replaced by static that seemed to pour from nowhere. Within the noise, faint phrases emerged, snippets of monologues, desperate pleas, and quiet, sobbing whispers. Julia clutched Greg's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "We need to leave," she whispered. But before anyone could move, the study door slammed shut with a force that shook the entire house. They all turned toward the sound, and for the first time, they noticed something chilling. Faint light seeping out from under the door, as if a performance were taking place inside. The light flickered like a projector struggling to stay in focus, and the muffled applause began again. "Stay together," Greg said, his voice barely audible over the static and whispers. Despite his warning, Julia found herself inexplicably drawn toward the study. It was as though something or someone was pulling her closer, urging her to step into the unknown. The others followed reluctantly, their footsteps hesitant. When they reached the study, the light under the door vanished, plunging the hallway into darkness. Greg hesitated, then pushed the door open. The room beyond was completely empty, just as they had left it. But on the desk, an old playbill now lay unfolded. None of them had ever seen it before. The title read, "A Streetcar Named Desire," and beneath it, in elegant, faded ink, was Karl Malden's name, prominently listed in the cast. The date on the playbill? 1951. It was pristine, untouched by time. Julia's breath hitched as she reached for the playbill, but the moment her fingers brushed it, the room plunged into chaos. The hum rose to an unbearable pitch, and every book on the shelves toppled to the floor. The door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. Then, as suddenly as it began, the chaos stopped. In the oppressive silence that followed, they noticed the shadow again, this time cast on the study wall. It was larger, more defined, and unmistakably human. It raised an arm, gesturing as if delivering a command. "You've forgotten the lines," the voice boomed, dripping with disappointment. "Begin again." The projector-like flicker returned, but this time it wasn't light, it was images. Faint, ghostly figures appeared, rehearsing a scene on an invisible stage. Their movements were elegant but mechanical, as though stuck in an endless loop. The shadow seemed to watch them, its head tilting as if critiquing their performance. Julia's trembling hand still clutched the playbill. What do you want from us?" she managed to say. The shadow turned toward her slowly, unnervingly deliberate. "To remember," it said, before everything went dark. The darkness was absolute, swallowing their breaths and every faint sound. Julia tightened her grip on the playbill, the coarse paper feeling unnervingly warm in her hands, as though alive. The room seemed to stretch, its boundaries dissolving into a vast, unseen void. No one dared speak, yet the weight of unspoken questions pressed down on them. A faint glow returned, not from the study lamp, but from the cracked mirror above the fireplace in the living room. The light pulsed softly, like the dimming marquee of an old theater. Then, impossibly, a faint tune began to drift through the house. It wasn't the tinny sound of the phantom radio this time. This was richer, almost orchestral. The melody seemed to swirl around them, teasing at memories they didn't recognize as their own. Julia stepped forward, compelled by some invisible force. Her housemates huddled behind her. As they made their way back to the living room, the glow intensified, illuminating the once ordinary room in shades of gold and crimson. The cracked mirror no longer reflected the room. Instead, it showed an entirely different place, a grand stage, its edges lost in shadow. Figures moved within the mirror, performers rehearsing under the watchful eye of an unseen director. "Do you see it?" Julia whispered, though she knew they all did. Greg's face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line as he stared at the shifting scene. The performers in the mirror weren't just acting, they were stuck. Their movements repeated endlessly, a tragic cycle of unfinished gestures and silent lines. Every now and then, one of them would pause, turning toward the invisible audience as if begging for release. "Look," Greg said suddenly, pointing to one of the figures. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that seemed decades out of style. His head was bowed, his face obscured, but his presence was unmistakable. That has to be him." Julia's heart raced. The figure's posture, the way he moved, it all felt familiar, as though they were watching old footage of Karl Malden himself. But before they could confirm it, the man froze mid-step and turned sharply, staring out of the mirror, staring at them. "Come," the voice demanded, low and resonant, vibrating through their chests. The mirror shimmered as the figure extended a hand, his shadow spilling out of the glass and stretching across the floor toward them. "No," Greg said firmly, pulling Julia back. But she couldn't move. Her feet felt rooted to the spot, her body trembling under the weight of that gaze. The shadow receded suddenly, curling back into the mirror. The glow dimmed, leaving them in a room lit only by the flickering candles they had forgotten they'd lit. The melody stopped, replaced by the faint crackle of static once more. "Julia," Greg said, his voice urgent, but she wasn't listening. Her eyes were locked on the mirror, where faint words had begun to scrawl themselves across the cracked surface in ghostly handwriting. "The final curtain is not yet drawn. And then, beneath it, you know your lines." "What lines?" Julia muttered, clutching the playbill. She flipped it over, searching for something, anything that might explain. Her breath caught as she saw faint, handwritten notes filling the blank back of the playbill. They were instructions, stage directions, marked with urgency. "Enter stage left," she read aloud, her voice trembling. "Do not falter." The words pulsed with an eerie glow, and suddenly, the entire house seemed to shift beneath their feet. Walls groaned, the floor creaked as though under enormous strain, and the hum began again, low and menacing. "What's happening?" Greg shouted over the noise, but no one had an answer. All they knew was that something or someone was waiting for them to act, and time was running out. The hum grew louder, now a resonant vibration that made the floorboards quiver beneath their feet. Julia stumbled back, clutching the playbill tightly. The cryptic stage directions on the reverse side shimmered faintly, as if alive with some unseen energy. The final line on the page glowed brighter than the rest. "The performance begins when you're ready." "We need to leave," Greg shouted over the growing din. But when he turned toward the front door, it was gone. In its place was a solid wall, as if the house itself had shifted to trap them. Julia's hand trembled as she pointed to the mirror. The figures inside were no longer rehearsing. They were watching. Every single one of them had turned toward the glass, their hollow eyes fixed on the living room. The man in the suit, the one who resembled Karl Malden, stepped forward again. This time, his outstretched hand seemed to press against the inside of the mirror, and the crack widened, spilling shards of dim light into the room. A voice no longer distant, but right there in the room spoke again, its tone urgent yet calm. "Places. We don't have much time." Julia felt an almost unbearable pull toward the mirror. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper, like an invisible thread tugging at her very essence. She looked down at the playbill again, scanning the directions frantically. One stood out, written in bold, "Look beyond the reflection." "Look beyond," she muttered. "What does that even mean?" The hum stopped abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. For a moment, the house felt eerily still. Then, from the upstairs landing, a faint rustling sound emerged, like pages being turned. The group exchanged nervous glances, and despite every instinct screaming to stay put, they found themselves climbing the stairs. The upper hallway was darker than it should have been, the air thick and heavy. At the far end, the study door stood ajar, a faint golden light spilling out. Julia hesitated but was pushed forward by an unseen force. The others followed, their footsteps muffled as if the house itself were swallowing the sound. Inside the study, the desk was no longer empty. A typewriter, old and battered, sat in the center, its keys moving on their own. Letter by letter, words began to appear on the sheet of paper threaded through it. "The audience is waiting." "What audience?" Greg demanded, his voice shaking. But before anyone could answer, the walls around them began to dissolve, revealing rows upon rows of empty theater seats, all facing the group. The dim light from an unseen stage illuminated the seats, and for the first time, they noticed movement. The seats weren't empty after all. Figures sat hunched in the shadows, their faces obscured. Some leaned forward, others tilted their heads as though observing the actors on stage. Julia's breath quickened. "They're watching us," she whispered. "No," Greg said, his voice trembling. "They're waiting for us to do something." The typewriter clattered again, drawing their attention. A new line appeared on the page. "The show must go on." The hum returned, louder than ever, and this time it was accompanied by a faint but unmistakable sound. Applause, slow and deliberate, echoing through the invisible theater. The group turned toward the source, but the clapping came from every direction at once. Then the voice returned, closer than ever. "Take your marks. The script is written. Now perform." The mirror in the living room pulsed with light again, its crack now spanning nearly the entire surface. Through the fractured glass, the figures inside began to move, stepping toward the broken barrier as if preparing to cross over. Julia's eyes darted back to the playbill in her hands, the stage directions glowing brighter than ever. "Enter stage left. Say the words they need to hear." "But what are the words?" she cried, her voice breaking. The shadow of the man in the suit loomed larger now, spilling out of the mirror entirely, his presence almost tangible. "You already know," he said, his tone both reassuring and chilling. The applause quickened, the theater seats creaking as the unseen audience began to rise. Julia's mind raced, the words on the playbill burning into her vision. "Say the words they need to hear." She glanced at Greg, whose pale face reflected her own terror. But deep down, she felt an odd clarity. Somehow, she did know the lines, they weren't hers, but they were embedded in her, as if drawn from another life. Taking a trembling step forward, Julia faced the mirror. The shadowy figure of Karl Malden loomed over her, his gaze expectant. The applause grew deafening, the unseen audience restless. "The curtain falls," she whispered, the words spilling out unbidden. But the echoes remain. The applause stopped instantly, replaced by a profound silence that pressed against their ears. The shadow froze, then began to dissolve, its edges fraying into nothingness. The figures in the mirror stepped back into the darkness, their rehearsals fading away. The mirror's crack healed with a sound like shattering in reverse, sealing whatever haunted the house on the other side. The playbill crumbled in Julia's hands, disintegrating into ash that scattered across the floor. The house returned to its eerie stillness, as if the night's events had never happened. "Is it over?" Greg asked, his voice hoarse. Julia stared at the now empty mirror. "For now," she murmured. But deep in her heart, she knew the performance wasn't done, it was only waiting for the next act. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.